Using techniques of DNA sequencing and sophisticated methods of computation, scientists were able to identify and catalog 26 parchment fragments according to the DNA of the animals on whose skin the scrolls were written. Another 13 leather artifacts were also analyzed. Hello everyone, Gabriel here. Welcome to Ancient Insights. If you are new to this channel, please take a moment to subscribe for more insightful videos on ancient history and archaeology. Thank you. The Dead Sea Scrolls consist of 25,000 fragments, but no one knows or has been able to put them together. A new study suggests a way to solve that puzzle, which sheds new light on life in this land 2,000 years ago. Over 70 years ago, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib entered a cave in the Qumran area west of the Dead Sea. Here he found large clay jars containing parchment scrolls wrapped in linen. The shepherd didn't know that he had stumbled upon the first piece of one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, which would come to be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. But even today, these archaeological finds continue to raise more questions than answers. A major reason for the continuous dispute is that the collection of scrolls in Israel today consists of nearly 25,000 fragments of parchment and papyrus, which it is estimated comes from more than 930 different ancient manuscripts. This vast jigsaw puzzle, with an unknown number of pieces that have been lost over time, includes the earliest versions of all the books of the Hebrew Bible, with the exception of the book of Esther, as well as the biblical Apocrypha, many other works previously unknown. The conventional theory is that some of those works were written or copied by a zealous Jewish sect identified by most scholars as the Essenes, who led an ascetic life in the desert. There is no general agreement that the collection also includes scrolls that originated from outside the sect, written by other learned individuals of that period. Accordingly, the question of which texts are unique to the sect and which were brought in from outside is crucial for understanding the significance of the text. And to that extent, they represent the ideas in the currency in Judea of the later Second Temple period between 334 BCE and 70 CE. A study published this week has harnessed the most advanced tools of biological research in order to help solve the mystery. Using techniques of DNA sequencing and sophisticated methods of computation, the scientists were able to identify and catalog 26 parchment fragments according to the DNA of the animals on whose skin the scrolls were written. Another 13 leather artifacts were also analyzed. This therefore helps the scientists to determine which fragments are related to one another and which ones are not. There are many scrolls fragments that have not been connected since this discovery was made. The researchers believe if wrong pieces of the fragments are connected together, it can change dramatically the interpretation of any scroll. According to Professor Rickavi, assuming that fragments that come from the same ship belong to the same scroll, it is like piecing together parts of a jigsaw puzzle. The methods the researchers employ have already helped to shed light on a host of important historical and religious issues, including how the concept of sacredness in regard to the text of biblical books changed over time, when basic notions arose in the realm of Jewish mysticism from which the Kabbalah sprang up, and what the origin was of the idea that prayer could replace sacrificial offerings, an idea that was formerly thought to have emerged only following the destruction of the Second Temple in about 17 CE. Before committing to matters of remote Jewish history, the researchers had to first overcome a series of challenges, starting with how to collect the sensitive samples. In most cases, to avoid damage to the priceless antiquities, the researchers extracted DNA from tiny scroll crumbs of dust that fell off or were scraped off the backs of the fragment. They even demonstrated that they could retrieve authentic ancient DNA from adhesive tape used in the 1950s to piece fragments together that was removed from scrolls. The first insight derived by the researchers related to the way inhabitants of Judea in the Second Temple period viewed the text of the Bible. Apparently, the Judaism of that era didn't have one standard version of each of the sacred texts. In other words, not every jot and title in the Bible was regarded with the same holiness it would later possess. The scholars reached this conclusion by examining 4 fragments of parchment containing sections from the Bible book of Jeremiah. Today, all editions of the Hebrew Bible are absolutely identical, down to the letter. This was the case even before the invention of printing. In fact, since the emergence of authoritative Masoretic texts of the Bible in Tiberias in the early Middle Ages, a version that has been preserved almost without alteration to this day. However, other even older versions of the scriptures also exist, notably the Septuagint. This Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, originating in Alexandria and dating to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, was eventually adopted by the Greek Orthodox Church and remain in use today. The differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint are especially striking in the book of Jeremiah. According to the biblical scholar Naomi Mizrahi, it is not a matter of the interchange of a letter here and there or differences between a few isolated words. The Septuagint text of Jeremiah is 15% shorter than the long version reflected in the Masoretic text. Furthermore, the two texts differ in the way their sections are arranged. In some of the prophecies, there are differences in the order and in the content of the verses. The result is in effect completely different editions of the prophetic text and at times entirely different texts. Apparently, the Judaism of that era didn't have one standard version of the sacred text. In other words, not every jot and title in the Bible was regarded with the same holiness it will later possess. Differences of this sort in the books of the Hebrew Bible disappeared in the wake of the destruction of the temple. What remained are smaller differences at the orthographical level, which persisted into the Middle Ages because the books were copied by hand. In late antiquity and the Middle Ages, rigorous mechanisms of quality control were applied, which ensured that the difference would hardly ever affect an understanding of the content. Which version of Jeremiah appears on the scroll fragment examined by the research team? One fragment contains a long version, close to the Masoretic text. 2 contain a short version that resembles the Septuagint, and the 4th has a different independent text. There was a scholarly debate over 3 of these segments about whether they originally belonged to the same scroll or came from different scrolls, because they look very similar to each other but differ in the writings of the copyists. The scientists discovered that the vast majority of scroll pieces they examined were written on the skin of sheep, an animal that could also be bred in the climatic conditions of the Judean desert 2,000 years ago. The fragments of the book of Jeremiah that stirred debate, however, were written on the skin of 2 different animals, 2 on sheep, 2 on skins of a cow, an animal that was not ordinarily raised in the Judean desert. For the scientists, the discovery of which animal skin was used for copying the text represents a significant genetic confirmation of the hypothesis that the writings was not solely the work of the desert set, but of someone from the outside. The researchers believe the scrolls made from cow skin were manifestly not produced there, but originated externally. And while theoretically they might have been brought to Qumran as blank parchment, such a scenario makes very little sense from a practical and economic point of view. So, it seems they were brought already as written manuscripts. Do you agree with this assertion? Let me know in comment. The conclusion that these are two separate versions of Jeremiah, neither of which apparently was copied by the local sect, but rather originated in a different context and place, points to the possibility that an openness to divergent views of the Holy Scriptures reflect a more general approach in Judea at that time. But the scrolls indicate that the multiplicity of versions was a basic feature of Judaism as a whole during that period, and particularly in Judea. According to Professor Michael Segal, who is an expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls, the new findings are consistent with the current notion that some of the scrolls came from outside Qumran. One reason is that some of them predate the founding of the community itself. One of the greatest challenges of DNA research is to locate genetic materials of sufficiently high quality to enable laboratory analysis. This is particularly true in cases of genetic samples that need to be extracted from the smallest fraction of ancient relics. To overcome this obstacle, scientists involved in the new research use a variety of methods that enable them to examine the surviving ancient genetic material at different resolutions. For example, the species animal from which the scrolls were created, sheep or cow, was identified by comparing sections mitochondrial DNA found in the cells of the parchment skin to that of more than 10 species of animals until a match was found. Other methods allowed the scientists to determine the genetic relationship between the different sheep whose skins were used in creating the scrolls. The second method, analyzing the basic genetic groups, haplogroups, of the sheep, made it possible for the researchers to derive insight concerning songs of the Shabbat sacrifice, one of the most intriguing and important tests found in the Qumran scrolls. A comparison of the DNA of the sheep showed that the scrolls found at Qumran were all made from animals belonging to one genetic population group, whereas the scrolls found at Masada was made from the skin of a sheep from a different group. The researchers did not expect this result. It shows that it is unlikely that this copy of the songs was brought to Masada by a refugee from Qumran, because the scrolls differs biologically, mentally from the scrolls found at Qumran. Interestingly though, the researchers believe the new biological information that has come to light does not rule out this connection between the sites. After all, the study itself shows that at Qumran there were scrolls made from the skin of different animals, such as cows. The findings, however, reinforce the possibility that the Masada scroll is not directly connected to Qumran. This is also a possibility that this religious work was widely circulated in the Judea at that time and has significant implications for understanding the spiritual life of Second Temple Judea. Another significant achievement of new genetic study is to enforce one of the leading methods today for classifying the Dead Sea Scrolls, which until now was based on an analysis of the way they were written. The comparison enabled them to distinguish between a cluster of scrolls made from sheep bearing high genetic similarities and scrolls made from sheep that do not belong to this cluster, and that are also genetically removed from one another. This time, the researchers applied DNA analysis to the nuclear sheep genome rather than the mitochondrial genome to evaluate the system of classification proposed by Professor Emmanuel Tove, who was editor-in-chief of the International Dead Sea Scrolls Publication Project. He classified the findings into two groups according to 20 scribal signs, such as how corrections were inserted by the authors, how words were spelled, how the name of God were explicitly marked, the tetragrammaton, and so on. According to this classification method, presented in a series of publications, the overwhelming majority of the tests possess contents that match one unique style, labeled QXP, the Qumran scribal practice. According to researchers, one scroll labeled Nun QSP were probably brought to the sect from the outside. It turns out that all the scrolls that were sampled whose nuclear DNA indicates that they belong to one cluster were classified as QSP scrolls, whereas the known QSP scrolls belong to different clusters. In addition, the fact that no genetic similarity was found between the external scrolls and the first cluster, nor between any of those scrolls in the external cluster, supports the hypothesis that the known QSP scrolls originated in various places throughout Judea. This study examines only a small number of the scrolls. According to the scientists, a promising path to solving the mysteries around the Qumran scrolls lies in expanding the use of genetic analysis. Let me know what you think in comment section. For more on the Dead Sea Scrolls, check this video. For the latest archaeological finds from around the world, please check this playlist here. Remember to subscribe, like, and share this video with friends and family on social media. Thank you very much for watching.